Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the chair of our board, Alan Broadbent, who's with us today, and the board and staff at IMFG, I'm excited to welcome you to a panel discussion on Legacies of the Megacity, Toronto's amalgamation 20 years later. Where did the years go? My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. And I'm also going to be your moderator for the panel this afternoon. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Never make them low enough for my height. I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maitrey, the Province of Ontario, TD Bank Group, and the City of Toronto. I'd also like to thank our team at IMFG for putting this event together today, in particular Selena Zhang and Elisa Tate. I would like to thank the event staff and the technical staff in advance of doing a great job here at the Munk School. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is at IMFG Toronto, and of course we do encourage you to do that. The decision to amalgamate Toronto in 1998, the Metropolitan Toronto and the 6 lower tiers, was pretty controversial at that time. And in some ways, it continues to be contentious today. 2 decades later, what can we say about the megacity merger? What were its goals? What did it intend to achieve? Are Torontonians better served by one large government than the previous 2-tier model with Metropolitan Toronto and 6 lower tiers? Looking into the future, what lies ahead for regional governance in the GTHA? So to answer some of these questions today, we have a panel of 4 speakers, 2 prominent voices involved in Toronto's amalgamation and the subsequent reorganization, and 2 what we're calling next-generation academics to discuss the opportunities for the Greater Toronto Region in the decades to come. And I will introduce them individually shortly. So who remembers amalgamation? As I look around the room, I thought it would be half yes, half no, but I think it's mostly yes. We remember amalgamation. But going back in history, long before 1998, in the 50s, and Don Stevenson, I know, is going to bring us lots of reports to tell us what happened back then. But in the 50s, in the Toronto area, there was the City of Toronto and a number of other municipalities. In 1994, there was a creation of the metropolitan tier of government with 13 lower tier municipalities. In 1967, those lower tier municipalities were amalgamated into 6. So when we were going into 1998, we had a Metropolitan Toronto structure, a Metropolitan Toronto tier, and 6 lower tier municipalities. Those were all amalgamated into one City of Toronto. And so there's the map that shows Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, York, East York, and the City of Toronto. So, back there. So we created the new City of Toronto in 1998, and some would argue, and I think I'm one of those persons who has argued, that we created a city that at the same time was too big and too small. In other words, it was too big to be locally responsive in the same way that the lower tiers had been in the past, reducing opportunities for citizen participation, and we're going to talk more about that. But also it was too small to deal with the big regional problems, the problems that go outside the now City of Toronto boundaries. And we're going to talk both about the local aspects and the regional aspects of the amalgamation. And one of the questions we often ask was, did it save money? So a number of years ago, back in 2013, Richard Bird and I wrote a paper for the Institute called Merging Municipalities is bigger, better. So that was in 2013. It was like 15 years after the amalgamation. We're now at 20. So it's a little bit old. And we tried to look at what happened to different expenditures. And this is a figure that shows fire expenditures per household, discounted for inflation. We looked at 10 years before the amalgamation, leading up to 1998, and 10 years after the amalgamation. And what you see before the amalgamation is a whole lot of lines, and those are the different municipalities and what they were spending per household on fire. And if we took them and took a trend going forward, you can see a downward line. If we projected going forward, we would have said that those expenditures per household on fire would have continued to fall. But what actually happened after amalgamation was the expenditures went up. I don't know if you can see that. Projection is down. I can't reach it, of course. But what actually happened was everything went up. And, you know, this is just about expenditures. It doesn't tell you what happened to costs. It doesn't tell you if service levels went up. It doesn't tell you if these expenditures went up because wages and salaries were harmonized in all of the municipalities up to whatever municipality was spending the most. We can't actually explain what happened, but we can see that expenditures per household went up. So that's fire. This is garbage collection, even more striking. The projection was the expenditures would decline dramatically, but in fact they went up. Parks and recreation, the same story. The only one that didn't meet this trend was libraries, where we projected they would go down if we didn't have amalgamation, and in fact they did go down after amalgamation. This is residential property taxes per household. And you can see that they were going down and they went up after. They went up for a number of reasons, though. At the time of the Toronto amalgamation, we also had something called local services realignment, where some expenditure responsibilities went up to the province, some came down. Province took over the education property tax, lowered it to give more municipal tax room for the municipalities. So property taxes jumped up in 1998. But that's partly because of the local services realignment. Then they started to decline after that. Of course, the other thing that went on in 1998 was property tax reform, which also had some impact. And these are the business property taxes. Again, they jumped up in 1998, but started to come down, in large part because the city had a policy to lower property taxes on business for reasons of economic competition. So was the amalgamation about cost savings? Was it about lowering taxes? Or was it about something completely different? And so now I'd like to turn to the panel to answer some of these questions. We have 4 people on the panel. The first is John Matheson. John is a partner and the head of Strategy Corp's Municipal Affairs Practice Group. But at the time of the Toronto amalgamation, John was the Chief of Staff for the Ontario Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. So I think he's in a good position to tell us some of the insights on the original goals of the amalgamation. Our second panelist is Shirley Hoy. Shirley's had a public sector career in municipal and provincial government that has spanned more than 30 years. She was the city manager for Toronto after amalgamation, so she's going to tell us about the joys of transitioning from a 2-tier metropolitan system of government to an amalgamated city. And we're happy to say that Shirley is also a board member here at IMFG. Then we're going to turn to the academics. Alexandra Flynn is an assistant professor in City Studies program at the University of Toronto Scarborough, where she teaches and does research on urban governance and local government law. Her focus has been on the local part of local government, and she'll be talking about democratic accountability. And lastly, Zach Taylor is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Western University, and I might say a former IMFG graduate fellowship winner. Zach's area of teaching and research are comparative political economy, regional planning and governance, local government and finance, and public administration. And he will be talking about how amalgamation has changed local politics in Toronto. So please welcome our panel. We'll start with John Matheson.
It's a real pleasure, and I want to thank the Institute for having me here to talk about this. Those of you who know me know I usually don't go anywhere without an extensive PowerPoint deck. But since a lot of this stuff, to some degree, it's the stories of others, to some degree, they're stories of mine, I decided I would go without paper because it would make it harder for there to be incriminating evidence. So I wanted to speak to you fairly frankly. I'm also relieved to be able to be having the conversation in a place that John Sewell doesn't know about, because generally he follows me around and shouts at me whenever I'm talking about this. I should also tell you that I've talked to Premier Harris and to Minister Leach about this, not recently, not in preparation for this, but for other times. And so while any mistakes are mine, but I am informed by how they think about things with the benefit of time. Let me begin by just sort of saying, if you're going to assess whether or not it was a success or not, you first, of course, have to think, just as Enid was saying, about what was intended and what they intended. And of course, part of the problem when you're talking about something as diverse as a government or a political party is there's no such thing as them. You're talking about a diverse coalition of people who were in favor of it, just as there was a diverse coalition of people who opposed it. And, you know, politics and public administration are very much a team sport, and there were a variety of reasons. What I wanted to do was emphasize some of the things that I knew to be the prime motivators of the people who were the decision makers. But I think one of the main messages I have for you is why they were doing it versus why they had to communicate it in a way they did weren't always the same thing. That's one of the limitations of being in politics. But I guess another one of the key messages I have for you today is don't believe the people who try to sell the monocausal vision of what it was all about. And in particular, be extremely suspicious of those who say the amalgamation was a sort of a drive-by amalgamation, a kind of a organized political gang hit on, Barbara Hall or the council at the City of Toronto. Because honestly, that's nonsense. I've been quoted in the past saying that's nonsense, and truly that is nonsense. At best, it was a somewhat pleasant byproduct for those who were actually going about to do something difficult and necessary, and they were analyzing it, and they thought, well, at least we're dealing with all this difficulty, and at least we get to give a swat across the head. I'm not saying there wasn't some politics to it, but that is a huge difference between byproduct and motive. It was never the motive to do something as dramatic as this solely for that purpose. And it kind of demeans the conversation or demeans the tradition of the ministry, which had far too many good people providing adult supervision over the politicians to actually bandy about in that. And I don't think that would be really appropriate. So what did they intend to the degree that there is such a thing as them? And the first thing you have to understand is, as important as I think the municipal sector is, the municipal sector was not the thing that was driving the government of Ontario in 1995. What was driving the government in 1995 was the politics of the budget and the politics of the deficit. And what they wanted to do was keep their promises, and what they had to do, frankly, was reduce the deficit. And what they were terrified of, and it's, you can only make the decisions when you make them based on what you know. You've got to play the cards that are dealt you in the order that they're played. And sitting in 95, what everyone was terrified of was a return to high interest rates. And it's important to remember that, like, an easy way to sort of think about the budget back in those days, it was only about $57 billion. Oh, for the day when the provincial budget was only $57 billion. And healthcare was about 30%. And education was about 17%. And so you're sitting at about half on health and education. And the government had said, we're going to try and reduce the budget without any cuts to healthcare, and they kept that promise. The healthcare budget went up like a rocket throughout the Harris government. Things got cut, but the overall spending went up at an alarming rate. And education, well, they were going to not do any cuts to classroom education. And so you think, well, geez, almost half of the budget's gone, and I haven't talked about anything else yet. Well, 15% was dealing with debt charges on public debt. And the scenario that we were handed and told about, that on pain of death we could not utter, was the Ministry of Finance had a real strong fear that the public debt service charges were going to go from 15% to 30%, that they were basically going to mimic healthcare spending. And had that happened, it would have been rather catastrophic, because as you remember at the time, whether we were or not to everybody's taste, we were very much at a bit of a tax wall in North America, because we were already the most highly taxed subnational jurisdiction around in North America. So there was no real strong sense that we could increase the spending. And social services were 18%. So the heading other, which included everything else other than social services, education, health, and public debt, was where you'd find anything to do with municipalities and libraries and police and that kind of stuff. And so that area, while it was singled out for cuts, became the recipient of a much higher rate of constraint than any of the others. And so the Ministry of Municipal Affairs suddenly went from being, a relatively regulatory heavy, but not necessarily a really important spear point of the common sense revolution. We certainly didn't campaign on that, but that's what it became, because if you couldn't touch all the other areas, what was going to be left? What did you think we were going to cut? So all of a sudden, the ability to try and find some spending cuts in those areas became of strategic importance as opposed to merely tactical importance to the government. Now, the municipal agenda, too, and it's important to set the context here, municipal governance change was just one of the pieces. And I know you thought I was going to talk about amalgamation, but amalgamation was very much a means to an end, the way it came about. Because there were 4 pieces to the municipal agenda, and people forget. One was reforming property tax, which was widely considered to be broken and a series of all sorts of problems on their own. There was the requirement to update municipal powers, and that was the changes to the Municipal Act, the first first comprehensive review in a very long time. There was the attempt to try and save 10% of the costs of service delivery across about $13 billion worth of spending. That's quite a material amount on a base of 57, like I was talking about, through what was first known as the Who Does What process, what came to be known then as WDW, and then what came to be known as the goddamn download, as it drifted through a government that kind of lost track of what it was doing. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But there were these 4 different components to the municipal agenda, and the target was to try and deliver some savings that would be material to trying to slay this $6 billion budget deficit at a time when that was the government's priority. So, how did we get there? Well, many of the folks in the room will remember how we started off with an acceleration of the Golden Report, and the accelerated Golden Report sort of said, well, let's scrap Metro and scrap the regions and replace them with service boards and try and create a proper regional thing that'll bring together the diverse municipalities of the whole GTA. And while that seemed to be consistent with something the Premier had uttered at a Toronto Star-sponsored thing just before the election, where he said, yeah, we better get rid of Metro because we have too much overlap, too many politicians, too many artificial boundaries, and too many taxes. So we wanted to get rid of that. The thing was, the more we looked at it, we said, well, gosh, with all due respect to the Golden folks, nobody loved unelected appointed boards at that time as a tool for greater accountability. Nobody really loved the idea of having even more go that way. Nobody loved the idea of trying to figure out how to disamalgamate the 70% of Metro services that were already being delivered at the regional level at Metro. So then you got a whole slew. There were virtually every different cluster or subcluster and class of mayor came up with a different report. Some were called, well, the 4 mayors, who were called the Gang of 4 in homage to the punk band, came up with a report that we referred to as the I'm okay and I'm indifferent as to whether or not you're okay report. Those were the big municipalities that basically said, we think it really is very inconvenient the way regions share money across our region. We'd prefer if they didn't do that. Perhaps you could make them go away for us. Toronto, North York, Oshawa, and Mississauga all took that position. We didn't like that so much. There was a sort of the 17 Dwarves report, as I recall, which was all the small fry municipalities, and they thought regions were a very good thing, and they thought that the more that you picked up the larger municipalities by the ankles and shook vigorously until the money came out of their pockets to help pay for infrastructure in those municipalities, the better those were. They found some allies because they tended to be in the 905, and so did we. That was not without some influence. But the bottom line was nobody could quite get their head around how you could try and promote getting rid of overlap and duplication by getting rid of Metro, which was a thing that kind of looked at working. And so while folks were pretty much terrified at taking on the mayors, that'd be my first alarm. While folks were pretty much, that or it's Hazel McCallion calling me again, while folks were pretty much terrified of taking on the 4 mayors, they figured that really the only thing to do was to build on the Metro that was there. That there was a desire to not have the Metro that was there be perceived as having won, and they wanted to start fresh. So hence the idea of dissolving everything and starting fresh, as opposed to just having Metro dissolve it. Now, what about the main rationale for doing it? Well, as has been said, one of them was about saving money, and the goal was maybe about $850 million over 3 years. So about, with some transition costs, maybe about $300 million a year. And I won't dwell on that. I mean, Enid's told you how some of that turned out. The second, though, was one that the Premier was very sincere about. And, you know, the Premier gets drawn as a kind of a cartoon character. That, frankly, was never fair. It's become less fair over time, and his kind of absenting himself from the equivalent of the rubber chicken circuit over 15 years has kind of left an open space for people to fill his void with assessments of his motives. So all I would say is, very shortly after he was elected, he wound up going on one of those trade mission things that people think are junkets to Tokyo. And perhaps there wasn't too much that came of it from a trade point of view, I don't recall. But one thing that left quite a lasting impression on him was he got there feeling pretty proud of himself as the Premier of Ontario. And somebody said to him, so, Ontario, is that anywhere near Toronto? And if you think about it, how many of you actually know what canton or Tokyo is in? He really got kind of a lesson, a practitioner's guide to anything that any of the folks who focus on the city-state as being the building block of the modern economy. And so at a time, you may recall, and it's easy to forget, but you couldn't open the paper without Mel Lastman saying something like, I got this great idea. We're going to put in a North York bid for the Olympics. Metro wasn't working as well as New York run by the Swiss at that time. You may recall that it was widely perceived as being pretty dysfunctional. And the people who hearken back to the good old days, I suspect often hearken back more to the 70s than the middle 90s. Though not everybody will call, although one person in the room here, I think, wrote a report on it, that the city of Toronto had a vote saying, yeah, we should just get rid of Metro in 1994. So there was an agenda that was alive and well about bringing about change. But I can tell you something. When I took the job in July of 95, our agenda was looking mostly like, well, we're going to have to try and figure out a whole bunch of things. But declaring war on governance structure in the GTA was not one of them. It was a hangover from the fact that the hand grenade had been pulled on the Golden Report. And we had to catch it and figure out what to do about it. The timing of it was driven very much by the electoral cycle, so it was hasty. But as reports talked about at the time, it was robustly debated, to be sure. So, you know, of the 3 goals, save money, improve better governance and better decision-making, and create something that was robust enough to operate on an international level, I think there was a 4th. The thing that they totally did accept about the Golden Report was all the work that the Boston Consulting Group had done about if you have a better regional group that can think about things regionally, you will build a lot less dumb, expensive infrastructure. So one of the other big savings goals was the goal that was intended to be achieved by just not doing as many dumb things, by achieving better coordination. So we did set out to try and do a Greater Toronto Services Board. However, we kind of ran out of political capital. And the ability to drive that change in a robust enough fashion was largely exhausted by the time the fight had run its course. I recall noting that we were on no less than 3 of the then 4 Toronto dailies, no less on the front page, usually above the fold, no less than 4 out of 5 days a week for 6 months. as Phil Abrams suggested to me a little while ago, well, at least you did raise the profile of municipal governance as an important issue across the country. And well, yes, we did do that. It was nothing if not controversial. And yet, just a few weeks after the great filibuster, we did polling that said about 60% of the people didn't really care that it had been happening. And so I leave you with 2 or 3 last thoughts. In addition to the challenge of communicating motive in politics, it's really hard to communicate something that's complicated to a room that is not full of governance experts. And yes, the governance messaging, rather like when Jerry Seinfeld said, I want to take back this jacket. Why? Well, out of spite. Well, you can't take back a jacket out of spite. Well, okay, then it's because I don't like the color. Nope, you said it's out of spite. You can't bring it back. Well, the government, if you were to hold them to the same standards, said it was about the money, because that was the easiest thing to communicate, and it's what people expected us to say. It was about more than that. And second big thing, if you're going to implement something that's going to take 5 to 7 years, you better make sure you're in power long enough to oversee its implementation. We didn't. And in fact, by the time we had our fingers so badly burned before even the bill had been passed, we put in place a weak form of transition team because people had told us, go jump in the lake. So we did. We did go jump in the lake. But what it meant was we didn't hold the hands of the thing and pass it into something that we could control. So I don't want to say that like we set it in motion, but we lost the mechanisms to control how it would actually turn out. So to the degree that whether or not it was implemented fully was something that became out of our control. So our predictions on finances didn't come out as well as they did. But more to say about it, obviously, this is something that I've thought about for the last 20 years, and I'm very happy to have a chance to talk about more when questions come. Thanks.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Well, you're quite a formidable audience. I'm looking forward to the discussion part. So actually, I'm going to hopefully, for sure, I have to keep my remarks to 10 minutes that Enid said we have. But I also am very happy to see so many former colleagues and friends I've had the pleasure to work with over, well, more than 20 years in some cases, but certainly throughout the amalgamation process. So I'm really pleased to be here to be part of this reflection on 20 years since amalgamation. So no surprise, my comments on the 3 questions that Enid mentioned about did amalgamation work? Did it achieve its goals? Is it better to be one large than 2-tier? And what lies ahead in terms of the regional governance consideration? My perspective will be from the public service perspective. And as we all know, the main purpose mandated public service at any order of government is to provide professional, objective, nonpartisan advice to the political decision makers. And once the decisions are made, competent and relentless implementation of those decisions. Whether in public or private sector, we have also learned that in order to implement well transformative change, such as amalgamation, certain key ingredients must be in place. First and foremost, the tone from the top, clear purpose alignment, everyone pulling the same direction, no working at cross purposes. In addition, the core values of the enterprise should be clearly articulated in order to build trust and respect and foster strong morale for the change. And just as important, strong communication from the top of the vision, the goals, in order that there's wide acceptance and understanding what achieving goals would mean. Effective execution also involves planning and deployment of the necessary resources, matching the staff skills to operational requirements. And finally, ongoing communications vertically and horizontally throughout the whole organization to ensure there's continued alignment of purpose. Assess against these core ingredients for success in transformative change. The Toronto experience is really a hard lesson on how not to do it. So, why do I say that? From the get-go, there was no clear purpose, alignment, no clear tone from the top. In the first 3 years in particular, it was truly muddling through the best we can, with the commitment, and this is due to the public service value, that there would be no service disruption in the communities wherever possible. During that time, everyone, politicians and public servants, thought that there may still be a chance that the amalgamation would be undone. Often in various service areas, staff, along with the elected officials, were pulling different directions with a focus on preserving what was in place pre-amalgamation. The morale was very low, very poor, with huge sense of loss, fear, worry about sanctions, rather than a new culture with incentives, support, and clear new directions. Secondly, there were many debates internally and in the media of what the main goals are of amalgamation, and John has already talked a bit about that. I think we will all recall that there was much talk about one goal: streamlining decision-making by reducing the number of elected representatives and layers of management staff in the former 7 municipalities, and in turn, supposedly, realize significant administrative savings. There were also conflicting views about service level, service quality, and access to services of the core municipal functions, in particular, such as planning, transportation, solid waste management, and parks and recreation. Along with amalgamation, the downloading of services, the Who Does What initiative, compounded the articulation of clear goals. The WDW was supposed to be revenue neutral. However, there was never agreement by the mayor and council, nor the public service, that this was going to be the case. Indeed, it was finally in the Provincial Municipal Fiscal and Service Delivery Review, established by Minister Watson, along with AMO in the City of Toronto in 2006, that there was clarity on more effective partnership between the province and the municipalities on the funding and delivery of a number of social services. And out of that exercise, a 10-year implementation plan was established. So the fundamental problem, re-amalgamation, was that there were no proper data information systems established at the time of amalgamation in order to determine performance measures and achievement of goals. So are residents better served since amalgamation? On the whole, I have to say yes. Painful as it was, the demographic changes in the city and the GTA, at the time, a major change in municipal governance in Toronto was very much needed in order for the largest city in the country to remain economically competitive on the international stage. Here I would note 2 important areas of change and improvements as a result of amalgamation. First, it accelerated the professionalization of the public services in the former metro and local levels. And given the size, scope, and complexity of the various programs and services to be provided, the enhancement of competencies and capacity in the public service was needed. Municipal public servants, as we know, tend to be very knowledgeable and skilled in specific service and program areas, whether it be transportation, solid waste, or parks. However, what is also needed in large urban municipal jurisdiction is the capacity to deal with major social, environmental, and economic issues. And this calls for the acquisition of skills in intergovernmental relations, partnership development, systems connectedness, and impact analysis and evaluation. Secondly, the increased transparency and accountability of the City of Toronto government through the creation of key accountability offices, such as the Auditor General, the Integrity Commissioner Office, Ombudsperson, and the Lobbyist Registrar, all contributed to the proper formalization of the council and public service relationship. I believe this has resulted in a much more effective public service. We're all still far from perfect, that's for sure, and there are a number of areas where improvements are needed. Other panel members will talk about this, in particular as it relates to meaningful and effective citizen engagement. So what about the future? I think the current challenges in the public sector, particularly at the municipal level, are much more onerous and demanding than, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And I just want to highlight 3 of them. The increasing frequency of extreme weather occurrences calls for the state-of-art knowledge, competence, and capacity in emergency management and risk assessment and management that I don't think at the municipal order of government we felt we had to deal with. We used to talk about the 1 in 100 years, 1 in 1,000 year type of disaster. Well, we're now seeing it once every few months. So the level of expertise we need to acquire in the public service is quite different. Second area of challenge, municipal government and social media. It's never a dull moment. I think managing the reputational risk at the individual level as well as the organizational level is a constant worry and very difficult to manage, anticipate, and it's something that I think, given some of the work we're doing with the municipal sector, and that's why Strategy Corp, not to be a commercial for them, but it's true that organizations like that now are needed because of this whole social media world that governments are not that used to dealing with. And finally, technological advances and the implications of service delivery. I was quite shocked to hear that City Council has now asked for the public service to look into cryptocurrency and what that means in the future. And driverless cars, of course, is another area that will have huge implications for cities. So these challenges demand the public service to demonstrate greater nimbleness, professionalism, and increased expertise and knowledge in providing advice and executing implementation, as they all are cross-cutting implications on service delivery. So the notion that some of these new challenges can be done by a particular service area division, they're long gone, and you have to find new ways of how to work together. And my last comment is with regard to the GTHA context. My advice is this is not the time to look at another regional governance review. There are too many challenges to the municipalities now. It's better to look at how to build effective partnerships and to make sure that you can deal with the issues and implement programs that are required. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, both with this esteemed panel, but also amongst all of you, bringing such expertise to the table in our discussion part of the afternoon. But I also wanted to mention that today is a bit of a party. You know, our city is 20. Its teenage years are hopefully over. The pimples and the growing pains, and it's now an adult. It's a grown-up. And barring any unforeseen changes from the province, we know its geographical boundaries, its inner conflicts, its personality quirks. And so now we can ask, what next? What next for this grown-up city of ours? So one thing that we know is that Toronto is too big and too small in some ways. As Enid has mentioned, the potion might not be quite right when it comes to financial authorities. But I'm here to talk about another way that Toronto is too big and too small, and that's in relation to political access. So what I'm going to talk about is first why participation matters, second of all, the kind of gaps that we see, and third, what we can do about it. And I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes so that, Enid doesn't kill me. So why does participation matter? So participation is essential to good governance. So as Zach, who's going to talk to you in a moment, has said before, participation is really a right to take part in a structure that is responsive and answerable. And this is really a relative concept, maybe a bit of a sniff test, where some places are considered to be better governed than others. And so really the difficulty is coming up with the right metrics in order to evaluate what we mean by good governance. But what's clear is that we need to have decision makers who, on one hand, have the authority and resources that they need to make and implement policies and coherent decisions. But at the same time, there need to be checks and balances to make sure that there is no predatory or arbitrary action. So as Zach notes, authority and resources without participation and accountability make for tyranny. But there's another reason why participation matters and why it's so tricky right now in this particular climate for municipal governments. And that's because the legal bar on participation is shifting. As Justice Sharon of the Supreme Court of Canada has said, the democratic legitimacy of municipal decisions is not just about elections, not just about every 4 years when people go to the polls, as we're about to do shortly in Ontario, but also from a decision-making process that's transparent, accessible to the public, and mandated by law. And so this means that participation and accountability aren't just about every 4 years. They're about an ongoing, continued necessity. Now, courts give a fair amount of deference when it comes to municipalities and what they do in terms of exercising democratic participation, but they have increasingly stepped in to force municipalities to provide, for example, adequate information to the public, public hearings, and to ensure adequate notice. And so the question becomes now, 20 years after amalgamation, what do we mean by the standards that a good municipal government should have, one that meets the legal tests that are out there? And the three that I want to talk about are drawn from the work of Tina Nabachi and Matt Leininger, who are at the forefront of research in this area, and whose research has inspired the International Association of Public Participation, which is increasingly seen as kind of the gold standard of participation amongst the municipal sector. And so what they outline are three kind of crucial criteria. One is that those affected have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. Second of all, public officials must seek out and facilitate the involvement of those who are affected by a decision. So this is not just about having a public hearing and seeing who shows up and handing them pretty brochures. There must be some proactive way that governments are seeking out the views and input of those who are affected by a decision. And then finally, participants must have the information that they need to participate in a meaningful way. So there has to be adequate information that is provided to those who are interested in the decision that's being considered by public officials. And so basically, the governance model has to have sufficient safeguards to enable participation to the broadest range of affected stakeholders. So I'm going to argue that our city of Toronto, now 20, much as we love it, has some gaps in participation, both at the local level and also at what I'm going to put in quotes, air quotes, as the regional level. So first of all, gaps that exist at the local level. So I hope I'm not causing any PTSD when I put this quote up. This is taken from Colin Vaughan just before amalgamation in 1997. And so one of the things that he noted is that there was a real fear at amalgamation that there would be a loss of contact with local officials if a megacity came to bear, that would be a real absence that would be felt. And so around this time, and maybe John can add some more clarity to this during the Q&A, the province stepped in and provided in the legislation that the new city of Toronto could consider having community councils and neighborhood bodies to ensure that this local voice still existed. And the idea at that time was that these bodies, these community bodies, would be made up of both public officials and of residents, kind of emulating the New York model. That was the idea. But unfortunately, that isn't what happened. The bodies that were created are community councils, which don't serve as forums for the participation of the public or really an opportunity for the public to engage in a direct way with their public officials. I could go on and on about this, but I'm not going to. I have pictures, I have other slides. We'll save that. But the idea here is that community councils are really operating more like local planning bodies with a very short laundry list of other powers that they have to make some delegated decisions. They're not this kind of proximity to local bodies. However, in the meantime, what my research shows is that other kinds of bodies have sprung up in their place, other bodies to provide this kind of more immediate contact, mainly between the ward councillor and residents. And these are neighborhood and business associations. So these bodies have more than doubled since the time of amalgamation. And what you can see is that their involvement is quite uneven across the city. So they are located in particular geographies and tend to represent affluent white interests in the city. And I consider this to be a worrisome turn of events in Toronto because of the polarization that we see in the city and the region. I think Zach might be talking a little bit more about this as well. But many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with David Holchansky's work and what he has noted about the increasing inequality across the city and how this inequality is increasing every census year. So this is not something that's going away. This is something that's getting worse. And this has, I believe, profound implications for Toronto in how it sees itself as a unified city and who's benefiting and who isn't from the kinds of decisions that are made. So now let's talk briefly about kind of the de facto regional level. So of course we don't have a regional government anymore in the Toronto area, but what I would suggest is that we have agencies, boards, and commissions which kind of operate kind of like a regional body in certain subject areas. And so I'm just going to talk about two recent examples of where we see participation gaps amongst these bodies. So the first has to do with sidewalk labs. So Waterfront Toronto, for many of you I'm sure are aware, is a body that is overseen by the city, the province, and the federal government. And Waterfront Toronto has recently entered into an agreement with Sidewalk Labs, which is a subsidiary of Google. Now, this agreement has not been made public, so we don't know the full scope of what's included in the agreement. And we also don't know a lot of other key issues related to what the plan is, what exactly is going to be developed, what other services might be included, like transit or social services. But even more meaningful for our talk today is the public doesn't really have a clear route of access to decision-making related to those plans. So Sidewalk Labs recently had a big consultation session, but Sidewalk Labs is not an accountable government. So who is it that the public would go to have their interests heard? Would it be the city? Would it be the province? Would it be the federal government? Is it Waterfront Toronto? Where exactly is the public meant to go? Another example is a recent decision that was taken by Metrolinx, which is a provincial agency, where they decided that they were going to expand transit services on the GO corridor in the Davenport area. And as this quote mentions, when the decision was made, many residents felt that they had not been consulted. There was no clear place for them to get engaged on the deliberations that were taking place, that the decision was made, and eventually it was just about what color do you want it, referring to the pillars of the second tier of the GO line that would be introduced in that area. And so again, this points to a lack of clarity for the public on where they go to have their interests heard. Who are the public officials that they can reach to ensure that their issues are taken into consideration? So what can we do about this? I'm an optimist. I feel like there is a way around this. We're here, we're kind of stuck together. Let's figure this out. So one thing that I think we can keep in mind in thinking about this issue is that accessible governance is really something that takes work. It's something that we have to continue thinking about. It's something that we have to take into consideration as the law changes, as norms change on what's acceptable. As Mariana Valverde wrote in her book from 2012, democracy at the scale of the city requires careful attention to how we solicit input and how we allow for citizen participation. And actually, the interesting coming from a court, but the new Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada said something very similar a few weeks ago. He said, you know, in talking about what are the next frontier for legal cases, especially related to public accountability, he said, listen, we're very lucky in Canada to have strong institutions, but we have to protect them. We have to work for them on a daily basis. And there are some things that are going on that are really positive that I think we can look to at the city. So for example, the city manager's office recently introduced a public budgeting pilot. They've now had it over 2 years, where residents in vulnerable areas of the city can take part directly in budgeting initiatives to choose what kind of improvements are being made in their area. Likewise, the city planning department at the city has introduced a number of different initiatives for reaching out to those that aren't the usual suspects who are going out to the consultation sessions. So for example, they introduced the Toronto Planning Review Panel, which is a lottery. I don't know if any of you were one of the lucky recipients, but 25 residents of the city will randomly get a notice that they're on this panel. It makes for a much more diverse set of opinions that are coming to bear. However, I don't think this is enough. I think this is the right time for participation in the city to be reimagined. It's been 20 years since amalgamation. It's been 10 years since the last governance review, when Toronto was just getting its feet wet. And in the meantime, many other municipalities, Vancouver, Victoria, Mississauga, just in the last few years, have looked comprehensively at how they engage the public, what their participation mechanisms are, to come up with a more modernized view of approaching the public. So Toronto can't fix Metrolinx, it can't unilaterally fix Waterfront Toronto, but it can fix itself, and I think it should do so. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As a now gasp ex-Torontonian, I'm really pleased to be here, to be invited back to talk about this place where I lived for so many years, and to share this stage with John and Shirley and Alex. This is really great. So, as Shirley told us, you know, amalgamation brought about the painful merger of 6 lower-tier municipalities, each of which had its own budget, its own staff, its own special purpose bodies, and so on, into Metro, right? And as I think John said, you know, Metro already spent 75 cents on every municipal dollar within its territory. And this process is now complete, right? We have this grown-up, this 20-year-old, as Alex put it. So we now have one public service reporting to one council and one mayor. We have one budget. We have one official plan. We finally have one zoning bylaw. So, you know, we can talk about these administrative questions, but putting on my political scientist tinfoil hat, what I want to talk to you about today briefly is another side of amalgamation, the political side. So although Toronto and East York and North York and Scarborough and Etobicoke were all linked through Metro, each was its own small world with its own history. It had its own cast of characters. They were governed by their own norms, their own traditions. Each had its own settled policy priorities, its own patterns of political alliance and axes of conflict. And amalgamation blew up these small worlds. So with amalgamated city came amalgamated politics. And I think this created 2 possibilities, both of which came to pass. The first is the potential for new political alliances that cross these old borders, right? You could build alliances that cross these boundaries. The second is also, you know, the second potential is for heightened conflict, because those small worlds were more homogeneous than this new body, right? This new big city. The range of conditions and preferences is so much greater in the big world of the amalgamated city. So how has this played out? Where does this leave us? Where are we? Well, you know, let's look at a familiar map, right? Let's look at the 2010 municipal election, right? This map, I think everyone in this room will be familiar with some version of this map. Quite a stark divide, right? George Smitherman won pluralities in polling stations located primarily in the old city of Toronto, and Rob Ford won pluralities everywhere else, right? We're each one big. So if we were to go back further in time, we'd see much the same pattern with some variation in 1997, in 2000, in 2006. A division between the old city and the old suburbs. But also, at the same time, the emergence of a pan-suburban coalition, if I can put it that way, that spanned these old municipal boundaries in the suburban zone. Now, David Miller won in 2003 and 2006 because he was able to add a diffuse level of suburban support to a constituency in the core in the old city of Toronto. Now, how can we explain this, right? I mean, one thing we can look to, this is the Ford vote map here. You know, we can get a sense of what might underlie this division between the core and the pan-suburban coalition. And I think some of it just comes down to lifestyle and the way that people who live different lifestyles interact with local government. So consider transportation, right? On the bottom there, I have the map of the propensity to commute by walking or cycling and the propensity to commute by automobile, right? And in many ways, transportation, mobility defines our lifestyles, the way we live in the city. So Ford really did best in places where people are centered on the automobile, and Smitherman did best where people weren't, right? And you know, what Ford promised in that election was opposition to anything that might impede free movement of cars, and that played well among a certain constituency that is defined by space, by suburban space. So let's jump forward to 2014. We see a different map here, right, in a three-way race. We see a pattern that breaks down the core suburb division that was so visible in these previous elections. As before, where each candidate won, they won big, right? Each activated a powerful place-based interest or identity. So John Tory did best in places with lots of people of higher incomes, lots of professionals. It was generally a whiter population. Ford did well in almost the mirror image world, right? Suburban neighborhoods with higher proportions of low-income people, more visible minority residents, more foreign-born residents. Olivia Chow did best in the low and medium income neighborhoods of the old city of Toronto. And if we were to superimpose the Ford and the Chow vote, we'd see that it looks almost exactly like that household income vote, except that they partitioned this space, right? They partitioned it pretty much where the old boundaries of the city of Toronto ended. Fascinating. So, you know, if we compare the 2010 and 2014 election, I think what this shows us is that multiple coalitions, electoral coalitions, are possible in this city. You know, to varying degrees, the 97, 2000, 2006, and 2010 elections played out as clashes between the identities and interests of the old city of Toronto and a pan-suburban coalition. By contrast, the 2014 election, and to a lesser extent 2003, overlaid city-suburb conflict on something else. The identities and interests of haves and have-nots, the established and the marginal. And the social distance between these two groups, between these disparate zones, is only getting wider as different parts of the city continue to be differentially transformed by very powerful forces. Deindustrialization, domestic and international migration, local and transnational real estate speculation, and gentrification. So what I want to pose here is this Toronto's future, right? Is this only going to get more intense? Will electoral conflict defined by these spatially segregated groups, defined by ethnicity, income, and employment, is this what our elections are going to hinge on in the future? Increasingly so, because these forces are so strong, because we seem to be farther and farther apart from one another. Well, one thing I do know is that the amalgamated politics of the amalgamated city are here to stay. The old core, right, which has been relatively unified in its political behavior since amalgamation, is but one part of an increasingly polarized urban landscape. The future of the amalgamated Toronto's politics will be determined, as it always has been, in the suburbs, outside the space of the old city of Toronto. Why? Because that's where 3/4 of the people live. So far, mayoral elections have more or less turned on whether the pan-suburban coalition constructed by Mel Lastman and reconstructed by Rob Ford hangs together or comes apart. So the open question, in my mind, is whether candidates will emerge, who can build new and hopefully durable electoral coalitions that bridge the increasingly segregated social and economic worlds, not only of core and suburb, but also of rich and poor, immigrant and native-born, white and visible minority neighborhoods. Toronto needs such a durable electoral coalition because the city as a whole, its patchwork of neighborhoods, and its government have very real social, economic, and fiscal problems. And to politically address these problems, Toronto needs to find its way through electoral coalition building, not to consensus, right? I'm a political scientist. I believe conflict is good, right? If we all agreed that, that isn't real. So not consensus, but some kind of durable political settlement where we can then figure out how to accommodate difference within a common framework. Otherwise, Alex is the optimist. I'm going to pessimistically predict that the Toronto's amalgamated politics will become increasingly fractious as its patchwork of social and economic interests and identities drift even further apart. So with that doom and gloom, I'll leave it to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the panel. We will go to the audience for questions, but we're just going to start with a few questions that I'm going to ask, and then we'll turn it over to you. I must say, though, when I started this afternoon, I said how many people remember the amalgamation, and about 3/4 of you put up your hands. I think, John, if I asked how many people knew what it meant to be above the fold in the newspaper, those same people would put up their hands, but nobody else would understand what we're talking about. This is an interesting discussion about governance in a metropolitan area. And I've been increasingly asked to look at this issue in cities around the world, large growing cities in Africa and South America, and they look to cities like Toronto to figure out how to do metropolitan governance. And the issue often boils down to how do you manage to have a regional vision, to provide transportation and land use planning on a regional basis, but at the same time have a very local focus to deal with neighborhood parks and local streets and local communities. And we did that in metropolitan Toronto from 1954 on. We had the metropolitan government that looked at the broader issues, the bigger items, and we had the local councils doing local work. But of course, it didn't last because the region, of course, extended beyond metropolitan Toronto, and that was no longer the right boundary. So the two-tier system worked well for a while, but then didn't. So I guess the question I have for the panel is, how do you do this? How do you, within a metropolitan area with a number of local governments, how do you balance the regional and local interests in the system? How do we do that in Toronto today? How do we get the regional working, but also local responsiveness? Zach, go ahead. Are you going to give us a pessimistic answer?
The subject of my my book, which I hope will be published in the next year or so. I have looked at a lot of places across North America, and all of them are idiosyncratic. I don't think there's a single answer to this question. So much is tied to path-dependent dynamics, to the weight of history and how we got from where we were to where we are now. Toronto, Greater Toronto, Ontario is distinct in practically by global standards in the degree to which things have always been quite centralized since the Second World War. The province has always been the key actor, the indispensable actor in making this work. In other places, things have emerged more organically in a bottom-up sense, and in some ways, they've been less ambitious but more durable, right? The problem with what we have is that we have been able to accomplish a great deal in the 50s and 60s with Metro doing a heroic effort of fully servicing, a growing metropolitan area that added 1 million people in 10 years. I mean, astonishing, right? But the province is the keystone in all this. When parties change, when political priorities change, when business cycles change, like any arch, when you take the keystone out of the top, the whole thing crumbles. And so we have gone from whipsaw to whipsaw, and in another month or two, maybe another whipsaw. And that is the bargain we've made with our history of centralized governance.
John?
So really, I mean, there's 4 key ingredients that must be present. There's no doubt more, but you have to have a plan if you're going to work together, decide what it is you're going to do. That sort of requires the ability to make decisions around the plan. It then inevitably requires the third thing, which is the money to fund the plan. And then the fourth thing is the political will to get you all 3. And, when political will is in large supply, then usually the money follows. And when the money is there, then you can get decisions made and, the plan comes together with it. But the problem is if you get any kind of breakdown in that, either because you feel like you don't have the money or because you bicker over what the plan is, or because people go into, hurdle mode because there's no political will, the whole thing comes crashing. And that's where actual leadership matters. And what I would say is if you, there were many great things about Mel Lastman. He took on the job, but his decision right at the start of his mayoralty that he was going to get reelected locally, and so therefore he would not play in the 905, doomed the GTSB to never take off. And sending Case Otis was not going to cut it. And then the fact that Case Otis ran into the Hazel McCallion buzzsaw at every meeting, it shouldn't be that the personalities were as dominant and influential as they were, and yet they are, which I think really builds on Paul's point that you have to, the idiosyncrasies of the times and the culture and the local politics.
And Shirley, you said towards the end of your remarks that we shouldn't be focusing on the regional governance issue. We should just work together as municipalities on a more informal basis.
Well, I think that I say this because, governance reviews and amalgamation, it takes so much effort. It diverts your energy, your efforts, all your resources to dealing with that rather than making things happen. And what I was trying to say there are enough big issues right now for the GTA municipalities and for Toronto to look at testing how do you work together? How do you deal with some of these without calling it a particular type of governance structure, but just make it work, make the partnership, make the negotiations robust rather than trying to do the review and create another new level of government or, all the negotiations on trying to create a regional government again. I don't think it's the right time because it's just too many things are happening that need attention right away. Just to your earlier question, though, about, can the City of Toronto right now with the with the legislative powers given to City Council and the Mayor, can it make the whole government work much better dealing with the big systems, service issues, and at the same time give much better attention to how to get residents much more involved and meaningfully involved rather than, as Alexandra's presentation indicated, we often just have, same people coming to the deputations and all that. I think where council's at now and the discussion about changing some of the powers of community councils, I think the residents and the various residents organizations are demanding that changes be made so that some of the powers of community councils be increased in such a way that you will get better local decisions again rather than having to go to the full council for vetting of final decisions. I think you'll see that over the next 3 or 4 years.
Alex?
I like what Zach said about the weight of history, but I would also say in the unique circumstances of Toronto, there's also the weight of Toronto. There's a lot of different ways to have a regional voice. It can be a government that's legislated like we had in Metro Toronto, but it can also be a much more informal body or a body that serves an advocacy role rather than has a set of delegated authorities from the province. And I think that's where we should go in terms of the GTHA. I mean, we only need to look at the weight of power that the GTHA municipalities had around the disaster management issues that took place a few years ago, where coming together resulted in a great deal of provincial funding for the member municipalities. So when they come together, they can actually achieve pretty important and forward-looking policy change. But I think the problem is that Toronto is such a big player in the regional space that its incentive to form those alliances is not the same as what the other municipalities face. And I think that's what's different than examples like, for example, the GVRD. So I'm not sure exactly what the answer to that is. I don't think it's the province forcing them to do it. But I think maybe perhaps as Shirley pointed out, seeing the benefits of having that kind of alliance would be a really positive step.
We'll turn now to the audience for questions, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to suggest we take 3 or 4 questions. And Ron, Larry? Your left, yeah. And then if we have time for more, we'll answer those, and if we have time, we'll go on.
My question requires some crystal ball, but in some ways, just going by the polls, it looks like, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if I just go by the polls, it looks like Doug Ford is the next premier. Is this going to be a kind of Harris redux? We can get the second version of, or is this a completely different, in the sense of what we're talking about, Toronto could be completely askew or a new agenda, or the outgoing city manager saying this isn't sustainable, as it is, the city's in big trouble in 10 or 20 years or even sooner. If we get a conservative government, not arguing for or against it in terms of is it the right or wrong, I'm just saying from Toronto's, anticipating what Toronto's what would have to deal with, if we get a provincial government that's going to go in a different direction, what does that mean for Toronto? Does it survive? Is it over? How do we function?
Okay, I think that we'll hold that and take Larry across the way. Yep. And
thank you. When she was Minister of Education, Kathleen Wynne came out with a startling idea. That is that the local school boards that had been amalgamated should be restored. And effectively, the problems that we've since seen with the Toronto School Board, which are enormous and prompted provincial investigation, it seems to me arise from the fact that the school board is not functional, and that maybe Kathleen Wynne had a good idea back then about restoring local school boards. I'd be interested in what the panelists have to say.
okay, gentleman there.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the great presentations. I know something about the budget process. I've been involved for a couple of years. Over the last couple of years, the budget decision-making process has degraded to the point where now the budget process is launched in one meeting in May by the Budget Committee, what they call a guidance or directions meeting. And then it withdraws completely to the staff. And the entire Toronto budget is built behind the scenes by the staff with zero, nothing, nada, no input from the public, no input from committees, nothing. Only to surface in October for the deputation process that was referenced before. We all know by that time the budget is fully formed. It's too late to make any important decisions and so forth. I know some of these people, and the reason they do it is they don't want to be bothered. They think of public participation as a nuisance. My experience of civil service is that there are two brands of it. The millennial branch, which is very forward-looking, visualized the Open Data Initiative, which was fantastic and well-organized, on the one hand, and then this old guard, which really literally wants to be left alone and wants to be to do its own thing. So Shirley, your description of the transition answers a lot and might explain why the Toronto civil servants makes like a turtle and really wants to pull in its head when it runs into difficulties. So my question is, I view that really as a cultural matter more than anything else. You know, there should be real excitement about where we are. We're a great city. But why are so large swaths of the civil service so reluctant to engage, as Jennifer Keesmaat has tried to show, for example, to engage in
I'm going to have to
public participation?
ask you to.
I apologize.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, we're running out of time. We've got one more question from Richard Gilbert, and then we'll go to the panel.
One what-if question has always intrigued me. John Matheson's minister asked me to be on the transition team, and I'd reviewed the situation and thought the task is impossible. You can't possibly do a good job of work in the 13 months that was left at the time before amalgamation was to have effect. And I said, if you extend it for a year, I'll join your team. But he didn't. If that transition time had been extended by a year, would amalgamation have been better or not? Would it have made any difference? That's my what-if question.
Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to direct these to specific panelists, but everybody can jump in. You know, John, I'm going to give you the first question, which is what happens if Doug Ford becomes premier to the Toronto experiment?
So quick answer is they're very different. Ford is a true populist. Premier Harris wasn't. Harris was a more desperate version of an old-school progressive conservative made so by the times. I mean, the best analogy I've ever come up with for Harris, for people who've never met him, is he was rather like an oncologist who felt that he had a patient who needed chemotherapy. Chemotherapy isn't a lifestyle that anyone aspires to, but when you're really worried about something, it's a course of treatment you go through, and then when it's done, you move on and you get back to something more normal. I think Ford is, Harris is frequently just lumped in with other neoliberals and whatever, and yeah, whatever. I don't really think that's the way he would have seen himself or does see himself. Ford's a different fellow and comes more out of the populist school. Whether he would ever take that on, I think we've toxified the brand name of forced amalgamations pretty well, so I'm not sure anybody would touch it anytime soon. So I doubt you'll get a Mark II. The biggest risk of it just comes from the ambitious spending targets that he has, because the reason I took you through the old structure of the budget to point out that if you red circle health and promise you won't touch education, then what do you think you're going to touch? And none of the structural problems of the province of Ontario are going anywhere. So everything you know about the broad structural issues, notwithstanding what the Conservatives may choose to campaign on, they're all going to be the real things that will have to be dealt with. So that's where the risk is.
Local school boards. Does anybody want to take that one on?
Yeah, I'd like to want to try this one. I worked at the school board right after I left the city in the fall of 2008. I started there in 2009. I worked there 5 years. And along with David Crombie, who chaired the board that I reported to, we helped the TDSB manage and sell off, because we were mandated by the provincial government to sell off some of their surplus properties. And the revenues went to the capital budget of TDSB. So to the question on whether or not, recreate local school boards would be better rather than the big TDSB, I would say that probably they're going to have to look at some version of a more effective kind of former local school board mandating the student success programs. However, as it pertains to real estate and managing the public assets across the four boards, I think the provincial government has to be more involved, and I think the experience of the Toronto Lands Corporation, which was the TDSB's real estate corporation, worked much better. Because otherwise you have local trustees all trying to be real estate agents, and you get nothing done. So if you were to recreate again the 6 local school boards and they're having the same functions, that would not work. But I do agree with you. I think they need to have the, recapture what work in the local school boards as it pertains to programming for the kids and achieving success for the kids.
So we had a question about the budgetary process, and I think, Alex and Zach, I'm going to turn that one to you and come back to John and Shirley on transition time.
That's a great question. I used to actually work at the City of Toronto, so I'm very happy to see some of my old colleagues out in the audience. There's no question that civil servants play a crucial role in the policy process at the city. And I think one of the tensions that we're seeing now at the City of Toronto, a post-amalgamation tension, is whether or not the city is like a mini province, or is it a different kind of government that has a responsiveness to the public that can't be compared to what happens at the provincial or federal level? My view is that it's a different kind of government, but I don't think that that's necessarily a view that's shared uniformly by people both in and outside the city. But I do think that tension is taking place within the institutions of the City of Toronto right now. And so I think that creates a bit of a conflict in terms of the policy process, particularly in terms of budgeting, about the degree to which you want to have the public engaging in decisions as the issue, to put as one of my old colleagues used to say, as it's getting cooked. How much do you want a whole bunch of fingers in the pie when you're still working out the kinks and figuring out the internal operations of how things are going to get passed? But I think another maybe more profound issue that's going on in the city right now is that I don't think it's necessarily the best time to be a civil servant in the City of Toronto. I think we're now on to, a number of years of civil servants being told that, they cost a lot of money and that they're not being efficient enough and that this is not a time to be creative, just do your work. And certainly amongst many of my old colleagues, it can create a very dispirited environment where there's not enough resources to really think creatively or go beyond the task list that you have in front of you. So I do think there are, maybe bigger, broader philosophical questions about the degree to which civil servants are answerable to the public. But I think at the city right now, the more profound issue is how do we communicate to a group of many talented and, I have one of my graduate students in the room who hopefully will work at the city one day, really impassioned, great people, that they have the room to think creatively about things like engagement.
Zach?
Yeah, I teach in a public administration program, and most of my students are mid-career municipal professionals. And one of the themes we talk about is participation, right? And this touches on participation in general, but also for budgetary questions. And the question I pose is, okay, at what point is the right time for people to involve the mass public? What time is the right time to involve specific groups, right? Expertise-based groups or interest groups or neighborhood groups defined by territory. And we talk about it for 2 hours and we kind of spin out, right? We reach this point where the kind of open house public hearing model is the worst possible way to interact with the public except for every other possible way. The dilemma is that the more you involve people earlier in the process, as Alex said, that can come at the cost of coherence, right? Though it may generate greater buy-in and support for whatever you end up doing. If you do it too late, everybody's mad, and I think a lot of public servants and politicians throw up their hands and say, well, everybody's going to be mad anyway, so why even talk to people? And I don't think anyone has an answer to this question. Not really, because I think we lack an ability to discriminate between when different models are most appropriate in different situations. I don't think we have a good answer to that question.
Thank you. So would the amalgamation have worked better if there were another year for the transition? I'm going to go to John and then Shirley.
Sure. Yes, it might have, but that might have been one of the things where the operation was successful, but the patient died on the operating table. At that time, the rhetorical inflation had reached, almost catastrophic levels. The government had blown its political capital on the subject, if you recall and go back and read the sort of stuff that the opponents of the amalgamation talked about, how the government of Ontario wanted to destroy local democracy and was going to callously impose its will, and all sorts of shrill allegations. Well, it's funny because we'd read that stuff in the paper and said, well, no, actually, we were just trying to do an updated version of what they did back when they created Metro. And so there was absolutely no way, once that allegation took hold, that we were going to make it come true by putting in a heavy-handed transition team. I mean, one of the reasons why we had good people in mind, like Mr. Gilbert, was because we were trying to find people who were respected and who were understood as being professional, but frankly, who didn't seem sinister. And if you think about it...
There you go, Richard. You're not sinister.
Well, Alan Tonks was our best definition of respected but not sinister. But he wasn't particularly well-resourced, because to have been excessively effective would have been to be excessively anti-democratic. And so it was not a task force that was sent out to be especially effective. It was sent out to do kind of a bare bones. And, we sort of bear the burden of what you might say is, if Mr. Sewell's worst nightmare was that it would be done and be done badly. And if Mr. Harris's, he wanted it done, but he didn't want it done and done badly. And the net result of the pure opposition that came out from the whatever you do, don't do it side, and the government's, well, we're going to do it, but we're not going to enforce our will aggressively, was you got the decision to go ahead, but with a weak transition, which some people might say was one of the things that made it the hardest to ensure that there was a robust implementation plan to achieve such savings as might have been achievable. So it went to somebody like poor Mike Garrett to try and do the impossible with, as Shirley said, a group of councillors at any given day, most of whom were quite happy to subvert the amalgamation in the hopes that they would win the court challenge that was still percolating along and, maybe undo the whole thing.
So that was the political answer to your question. We'll turn to Shirley for the administrative answer.
Well, I would add that if you're going to have another year, the only way that it could be successful is that if there were built-in incentives and support. I think the biggest failing of the amalgamation was that the expectation, to nobody's fault, but politically that message that, as soon as you amalgamate, you should be achieving savings. That was just unrealistic. And our mayor of the day didn't help when he said 3 years of no increase in the budget. So the whole message was out in the public's mind and internally for the poor public servants was that, it was impossible to achieve. So everybody got so discouraged, nothing was going to be done. But if you were going to have another year and you were on it, Richard, you would have said, put in some incentives, give them some care and support, and make it happen, right? And that didn't happen.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it was an interesting year in 1998 for those of us who were around, because it wasn't just the Toronto amalgamation, it was the local services realignment and property tax reform. And I remember people saying to me, my property tax is going to change, and I said, probably they will, but I don't know if it's because of the amalgamation, the property tax reform, or the local services realignment, which is an interesting way to do public policy. This has been a great discussion. I want to thank the panelists. I think it's important after 20 years to move beyond the question of whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. It's with us to stay and how to make Toronto work both at a regional level and at the local level going forward, I think is what we need to focus on. So thank you to John Matheson, Shirley Hoy, Alex Flynn, and Zach Taylor for a great discussion.